Most fortunes never arrive in perfect condition. They arrive disguised as someone else's mistake. On a cool Tuesday morning in early April of 1998, another logging truck backed slowly onto the edge of Emily Carter's property in Jackson County, Kentucky, lifted its steel bed, and sent a fresh pile of crooked hickory logs tumbling onto a patch of ground that most people in the county had stopped noticing years earlier. The driver signed a disposal receipt, nodded toward Emily without getting out of the cab, and pulled back onto State Route 15 before the dust had settled. By lunchtime, the sawmill would repeat the same routine with another truck, and by the end of the week, another dozen twisted trunks would join the hundreds already resting beneath the morning sun. Nobody in the county understood why Emily kept saying yes. The mill certainly did not. To them, the arrangement was convenient. Every crooked hickory log cost money to haul somewhere else, and Emily's unused pasture solved a problem that nobody wanted to think about. The truck drivers joked that she was running the largest firewood pile in eastern Kentucky. The graders at the mill called the logs rejects before they even reached the sorting deck. Buyers walked past them without slowing down because the trunks bent too sharply, twisted too deeply, or forked too low to produce long, straight boards. In an industry that measured value with tape measures, grading stamps, and straight grain, crooked wood belonged at the bottom of the list. That was simply how the business worked. Or at least that was what everyone believed. Jackson County had lived beside hardwood forests for generations. White oak, red oak, walnut, maple, ash, and hickory had shaped the local economy long before most families could remember who first cut timber on their land. Every logging crew knew exactly what the mills wanted. Every sawmill trained its graders to remove imperfections as quickly as possible because efficiency kept production moving and production kept contracts alive. Straight logs became flooring, furniture, cabinets, and lumber stacked neatly on rail cars heading toward factories hundreds of miles away. Crooked logs slowed everything down. They wasted saw blades, complicated cutting plans, and reduced board recovery. They represented lost time, lower margins, and extra handling costs. The system had become so familiar that few people questioned whether it was seeing the whole picture. And that is where this story truly begins. Because while nearly everyone in Jackson County looked at those bent hickory trunks and saw disposal costs, one woman watched them disappear into carefully organized rows that stretched farther across her property every single year. She never argued with the truck drivers. She never corrected the mill supervisors. She simply pointed toward the next open space, watched another load settle onto the ground, and quietly wrote the delivery date inside a weathered notebook she carried everywhere. 11 years would pass that way. Seasons would change. Winters would harden the bark, summers would dry the timber, and truck after truck would continue delivering what the industry believed had no meaningful future. What nobody realized was that Emily Carter was not collecting discarded wood. She was collecting something far more valuable, and before Jackson County finally understood what she had seen from the very beginning, the same companies that had spent more than a decade paying to get rid of those crooked hickory logs would find themselves coming back to her land for an entirely different reason. Jackson County had never measured a tree by how well it could survive a forest. It measured a tree by how efficiently it could pass through a sawmill. That distinction mattered more than almost anyone realized. The hardwood industry across eastern Kentucky depended upon consistency. Logging crews felled trees during the cooler months, skidders dragged them to loading sites, and tractor trailers carried them to mills where every log entered the same quiet system of inspection. Length came first. Diameter came second. Straightness followed immediately after because straight fiber produced predictable lumber, and predictable lumber kept customers satisfied. Every extra curve forced a different cutting plan, reduced the number of usable boards, increased waste, and slowed production lines that were designed around speed rather than exceptions. The grading rules had been refined through decades of experience, and they worked remarkably well for the products the mills were built to manufacture. Flooring companies wanted long planks. Cabinet makers wanted clear boards. Furniture plants wanted uniform dimensions. Crooked trunks rarely produced any of those things. They were not considered defective because they were weak. They were considered defective because they interrupted efficiency. There is an important difference between those two ideas. Let me tell you about hickory because understanding the wood itself is the only way to understand what Emily Carter was quietly building. Hickory has long been one of the toughest hardwoods growing in the eastern United States. It combines exceptional density with remarkable impact resistance, qualities that have made it the preferred material for generations of axe handles, sledgehammer handles, splitting mauls, striking tools, and countless pieces of farm equipment that absorb repeated shock. Unlike decorative hardwoods, chosen primarily for appearance, hickory earned its reputation through performance. Craftsmen often judged a handle not by how smooth it looked, but by how faithfully its fibers transferred force without breaking. The secret lived inside the grain. Long, continuous fibers carried energy through the wood while reducing sudden fractures under repeated impacts. That characteristic made grain direction far more important than perfect appearance. Yet most commercial grading systems had never been designed around handle manufacturing. They had been designed around lumber recovery. Those were two completely different businesses evaluating the same tree through completely different priorities. The mill managers understood board feet. Furniture buyers understood clear faces. Flooring companies understood straight cuts. Very few people still understood handle wood because many of the small regional handle shops had disappeared throughout the 1980s as imported products entered the market and larger manufacturers consolidated production. Knowledge disappeared quietly. Skills retired with older craftsmen. Buyers stopped asking different questions because they no longer expected different answers. Emily listened to those conversations for years without joining them. Whenever another truck unloaded its twisted cargo, she walked slowly through the pile before marking each delivery inside her notebook. She measured bends that other people ignored. She studied branching patterns. She examined bark, growth rings, and natural curves with the patience of someone searching for information rather than inventory. To passing drivers, it looked like nothing more than another afternoon spent wandering among discarded logs. But every observation added another piece to a picture that only she seemed able to see. What appeared to be an ever-growing collection of unwanted timber was gradually becoming something far more organized. And although nobody outside her property understood why every crooked trunk seemed to matter, Emily already knew that the answer had very little to do with lumber and everything to do with the direction in which a tree had spent its entire life growing. Let me tell you about Emily Carter because the logs were never the beginning of this story. They were only the part that everyone else could see. Emily was 39 years old in the spring of 1998, and she had spent her entire life on the same 180-acre family farm outside McKee, Kentucky, where narrow valleys, hardwood ridges, and small hay fields blended together in a landscape that rewarded patience far more often than speed. Her grandfather, Samuel Carter, had purchased the original 80 acres in 1951 after returning from military service with little more than modest savings and a determination to build something that could remain in the family. He never considered himself a timber businessman. He called himself a caretaker who happened to harvest trees when the forest decided they were ready. Emily's father, Thomas Carter, inherited both the land and that philosophy. He expanded the property piece by piece during the 1970s, adding neighboring parcels whenever another family decided to sell. He raised cattle, repaired fences, cut hay in the summer, and spent cold winter mornings shaping replacement handles for axes, splitting mauls, mattocks, hammers, and sledgehammers used throughout the county. He rarely advertised his work because he never had to. Farmers, loggers, mechanics, and volunteer firefighters all knew that if one of Thomas Carter's handles fit properly, it would probably outlast the tool itself. Emily learned long before she understood woodworking that every piece of timber carried a story hidden beneath its bark. As a little girl, she followed her father through the woods carrying a tape measure that seemed almost as tall as she was. Thomas never asked her to memorize species first. Instead, he asked different questions. Which direction had the tree leaned towards sunlight? Where had the strongest branches formed? Which side had survived the prevailing winter winds? He believed those answers revealed more about a tree than its height ever could. On rainy evenings, after chores were finished, he would spread unfinished handles across an old oak workbench inside the barn and explain why two pieces cut from the same tree could behave completely differently after years of hard use. He often repeated one sentence until Emily could hear it in her mind before he even spoke. Wood chooses its purpose long before people decide what to build. Emily never forgot those words because they explained far more than woodworking. They explained how her father looked at people, land, seasons, and even failure. He believed usefulness could not always be recognized immediately, especially by systems built to reward speed over understanding. By the time Emily graduated from high school, many neighbors encouraged her to leave Jackson County for a larger city where manufacturing jobs promised steady paychecks and predictable hours. She considered it briefly, but every trip away from home only confirmed that the lessons she valued most had already been waiting inside the hills where she grew up. She stayed, helped manage the farm after her mother's health began to decline, and quietly continued studying wood with the same curiosity her grandfather had once carried into those forests nearly half a century earlier. Very few people noticed how often she visited old tool collections, spoke with retired handle makers, or searched through forgotten trade manuals at county libraries. They assumed she was simply maintaining the family property. In reality, Emily Carter was preserving a kind of knowledge that almost everyone else had allowed to disappear, and before long that forgotten knowledge would begin changing the meaning of every crooked hickory log arriving at the edge of her land. If a tree could explain the direction of its own growth, it would probably tell a very different story than the one written on a lumber grading sheet. That was the lesson Emily Carter had been quietly assembling for most of her life. During the late 1990s, whenever the daily work around the farm was finished, she walked among the stacked hickory logs with a carpenter's pencil tucked behind one ear and a moisture meter, measuring tape, and small notebook resting inside an old leather tool bag that had once belonged to her father. She never hurried because there was no production schedule waiting for her. Instead, she studied each trunk as though it had spent decades recording information that most people had forgotten how to read. The bends that caused mill graders to reject a log often marked the places where the tree had adapted to changing sunlight, shifting soil, or years of steady wind. Those curves were not signs of weakness. They were evidence of survival. Let me explain why that mattered. Wood is built from long cellular fibers that develop year after year as a tree grows. When a straight tree stands in an open area with few environmental challenges, those fibers generally follow a predictable direction that makes milling into boards efficient. But a hickory growing on a steep Kentucky hillside rarely experiences such perfect conditions. It leans toward available light, resists winter storms, supports heavy branches, and slowly adjusts to changing loads throughout its lifetime. Instead of breaking, it responds by growing additional wood around areas of stress, allowing its fibers to flow through natural curves while remaining remarkably continuous. For a lumber mill focused on producing long straight boards, those curves reduce efficiency because rectangular boards inevitably cut across changing grain directions. For someone building striking tool handles, however, the priorities are entirely different. A well-selected natural curve can align the grain with the shape of the finished handle, preserving continuous fibers from one end to the other. Continuous fibers distribute repeated impact more evenly, reducing the likelihood of sudden failure during years of demanding use. That difference cannot always be recognized by looking only at the outside of a log. It requires understanding how the tree responded to its environment over decades of growth. Emily had spent enough years beside her father to recognize those patterns almost instinctively. She marked certain logs with small chalk symbols that nobody else understood, separating them according to curvature, estimated grain flow, drying potential, and future applications that existed only inside her own plans. Passing neighbors occasionally slowed their pickup trucks to watch her working among piles that seemed to grow larger every season. Some smiled politely. Others assumed she simply disliked throwing anything away. A few suggested she should clear the space before insects or decay ruined everything. Emily thanked them for their concern, then returned to her notebook without explaining a single detail. She understood something that experience had taught her long ago. People often dismiss careful observation because it does not produce immediate results. Yet nature rarely rewards impatience. Every additional truckload strengthened a collection that looked increasingly ordinary to everyone except the one person who understood exactly what she was preserving. Unknown to the mills, every carefully chosen log resting across her property represented another future handle that had not yet been shaped, another opportunity waiting for the right moment. and another quiet reminder that the forest had been solving engineering problems long before people invented grading rules to judge its work. By the autumn of 2003, the routine had become so ordinary that almost nobody noticed it anymore. The logging trucks still arrived several times each month. The drivers still waved as they turned onto Emily Carter's gravel lane, and another collection of twisted hickory trunks quietly joined the rows that now stretched across nearly 4 acres near the edge of the property. Rain darkened the bark during spring. Summer heat slowly reduced the moisture locked inside the wood, and each passing winter completed another stage of a process that Emily never attempted to rush. She understood that quality could not be forced by a calendar. Freshly cut hardwood contains a significant amount of internal moisture, and removing that moisture too quickly often creates checking, warping, or internal stress that permanently reduces its usefulness. Air drying had always been part of her family's approach because her father believed that would deserve time to reach its own balance with the surrounding environment. Emily followed that lesson with remarkable consistency. Every suitable log was elevated above the ground, positioned to encourage natural airflow, protected from standing water, and carefully documented inside the same weathered notebook she had carried for years. Each entry included the delivery date, estimated diameter, visible grain direction, natural sweep, and drying location. Looking at the notebook from a distance, someone might have mistaken it for farm records. In reality, it was becoming a map of future possibilities. Let me tell you what made those years so unusual. While the hardwood industry focused almost entirely on the next shipment, the next contract, and the next production schedule, Emily invested in something that offered no immediate return at all. She accepted storage costs, spent countless hours organizing material that nobody else wanted, and quietly allowed nature to complete work that machinery could not accelerate without consequences. Neighbors occasionally asked whether she planned to sell the logs as firewood before insects damaged them. Others suggested renting a portable sawmill and cutting whatever boards could still be recovered. Emily smiled politely, thanked them for the advice, and returned to measuring another stack without explaining why neither option interested her. She had already learned that the greatest value inside many of those trees would never appear as dimensional lumber. It would emerge only after the wood had dried slowly enough to preserve its strength and stability for the purpose she envisioned. Year after year, the collection became increasingly selective rather than increasingly random. Some logs remained untouched because they possessed unusual natural curves. Others were rotated periodically to improve airflow. A few were marked with colored chalk to indicate particularly promising grain patterns that could eventually produce outstanding handle blanks. Visitors noticed the growing inventory, but failed to notice the growing system hidden within it. To them, the rows looked like accumulated leftovers. To Emily, every stack represented another chapter in an inventory assembled with intention instead of urgency. 11 quiet years had now transformed what began as a convenient disposal arrangement into one of the most unusual private collections of properly seasoned crooked hickory in the region. The remarkable part was not that Emily had saved the wood. The remarkable part was that she had spent more than a decade preparing for an opportunity that had not yet arrived, trusting that one day the market would begin asking a question it had forgotten how to ask. And when that moment finally came, she intended to have the answer waiting long before anyone else recognized the need. The opportunity arrived so quietly that almost nobody recognized it at first. During the winter of 2009, conversations inside the regional hardwood business began changing in subtle ways. Mill managers were not talking about record production anymore. Instead, they were discussing delayed orders, tightening inventories, rising transportation costs, and an increasing difficulty finding specialty hardwood that met increasingly specific manufacturing requirements. The recession had forced companies across the country to reduce inventory, close smaller facilities, and simplify purchasing decisions. Efficiency became more important than ever, which meant many manufacturers stopped keeping large reserves of specialty material. At first, few people connected those decisions to the stacks of seasoned hickory resting on Emily Carter's farm. There seemed to be no reason they would matter. Then another shift began. Tool manufacturers that had survived the changing market discovered that customers still expected dependable products built with durable natural handles rather than inexpensive substitutes that often failed to deliver the same balance or feel. Replacement handle suppliers started searching for consistent sources of high-quality hickory, but years of changing harvesting practices had quietly reduced the availability of exactly the kind of wood that experienced craftsmen preferred. Many younger forests produced smaller trees, while commercial logging operations naturally prioritized the straightest stems because those generated the greatest immediate return as lumber. Material with unusual natural grain had become increasingly difficult to locate because nobody had been intentionally preserving it. Let me tell you what happened next, because this was the moment when more than a decade of patient observation began revealing its purpose. One afternoon, an independent buyer visiting several mills across eastern Kentucky mentioned to a local equipment repair shop that finding premium handle stock had become unexpectedly challenging. The shop owner laughed and replied that if anyone around Jackson County understood unusual hickory, it was probably Emily Carter. The comment was made almost casually, yet it started a conversation that continued from one person to another until it finally reached someone willing to drive out and see her property with fresh eyes. Unlike the truck drivers who had delivered loads for years, this visitor did not look only at the outside shape of the logs. He walked beside the drying rows, paused repeatedly to study the natural curves, examined the exposed end grain, and asked questions that Emily had not heard in a very long time. How long had each stack been drying? Where had the trees grown? Which logs had developed under hillside stress? Which pieces still contained uninterrupted grain through their natural sweep? Emily answered every question by opening the same weathered notebook she had maintained since the first delivery. Dates, measurements, locations, observations, and drying history filled page after page with careful handwriting stretching back more than 11 years. The visitor slowly closed the notebook and looked across the rows once again. For the first time since the trucks had begun arriving, someone else was no longer seeing a disposal site. He was seeing an organized inventory that could not be recreated quickly at any price. Word began spreading through a small circle of manufacturers and specialty buyers that an unusual supply of properly seasoned hickory existed on a quiet farm outside McKee, and before long the road that had carried unwanted logs for more than a decade would begin welcoming an entirely different kind of visitor. The first people to return were not strangers. They were men whose trucks had traveled the same gravel lane for years carrying loads that nobody expected to see again. One crisp morning in the spring of 2010, a familiar pickup eased through Emily Carter's entrance and stopped beside the oldest rows of drying hickory. The driver climbed out, removed his cap, looked across the carefully organized stacks, and smiled with the kind of expression that appears only when someone suddenly realizes they have misunderstood something for a very long time. He remembered delivering some of those logs more than a decade earlier. At the time, everyone at the mill believed they were simply reducing disposal costs. Now those same logs were being examined one by one instead of ignored. Let me tell you what changed. The conversation was no longer about getting rid of wood. It was about finding wood that could no longer be found through ordinary supply channels. Buyers who specialized in replacement handles, striking tools, and premium woodworking projects began arriving with notebooks instead of assumptions. They asked about drying times, grain direction, hillside origin, and natural curvature before discussing price. Emily answered each question with quiet confidence because every detail had already been documented years before anyone thought to ask. She never exaggerated the quality of her inventory. She simply explained how each group of logs had been selected, how long they had seasoned, and why certain pieces possessed characteristics that could not be recreated through faster-growing plantation timber or rushed drying schedules. The visitors walked slowly through the rows, occasionally stopping to study a naturally curved trunk that most grading systems would have rejected immediately. Some carried moisture meters. Others brought small hand lenses to inspect the end grain. The more carefully they looked, the more valuable the collection appeared. News spread gradually through a network of specialty manufacturers that depended upon reliable hardwood rather than high-volume commodity lumber. Each recommendation led to another phone call, another visit, and another buyer curious enough to see the property for themselves. Emily noticed something she had never expected. The same industry that once measured every log according to standardized efficiency was beginning to appreciate qualities that could not be captured by a grading stamp alone. Experience was replacing assumption. Craftsmanship was beginning to matter again. Before long, several companies asked whether she could provide selected handle blanks rather than whole logs. Emily declined politely. She had spent too many years studying the material to surrender the most important part of the process. If the grain determined the strength of the finished product, then shaping the handle required the same careful judgment that had guided the original selection of each tree. Selling raw material would have ended the story too early. Instead, she invested in additional woodworking equipment, restored several machines that had belonged to her father, and converted part of an old equipment shed into a modest production workshop where every blank could be oriented according to the natural flow of its fibers. She was no longer preparing inventory for someone else's business. She was preparing to build one of her own. The trucks that had once delivered unwanted timber now arrived, carrying visitors who came looking for knowledge instead of convenience. And with every conversation, Emily realized that the greatest opportunity was not hidden inside the wood itself. It was hidden inside everything she had learned while everyone else believed there was nothing worth learning at all. By the end of 2011, the workshop behind Emily Carter's farmhouse sounded very different from the busy mills scattered across eastern Kentucky. There were no conveyor systems, no production quotas posted on walls, and no stacks of standardized lumber moving through automated equipment. Instead, every morning began with the same deliberate routine her father had followed decades earlier. Emily selected a single-seasoned hickory log, studied the natural direction of its grain, marked the strongest continuous fiber lines with a carpenter's pencil, and planned every cut before a blade ever touched the wood. She believed that each handle already existed inside the log. Her responsibility was simply to remove everything that did not belong. Let me tell you why that philosophy mattered. Most manufacturers design products around manufacturing efficiency, making the material adapt to the factory. Emily reversed that relationship. She adapted every manufacturing decision to the material itself. If one natural curve allowed the grain to follow the shape of a striking tool handle more smoothly, she preserved that curve instead of forcing the wood into a perfectly straight pattern. If another blank revealed subtle grain deviation after the first cut, she reassigned it to a different product better suited to its characteristics. Nothing was rushed because every decision affected durability. Customers noticed the difference long before they understood the reason behind it. Local hardware stores began placing repeat orders after receiving positive feedback from mechanics, farmers, carpenters, and forestry crews who appreciated handles that felt balanced in the hand and remained dependable through years of regular use. Soon afterward, regional tool restoration businesses contacted Emily directly, asking whether she could produce replacement handles for vintage American tools whose original quality had become increasingly difficult to match. Instead of expanding too quickly, she documented every customer response with the same discipline she had once used while recording log deliveries. She noted which handle profiles worked best for different trades, how customers described comfort after extended use, and which grain orientations consistently delivered the greatest durability. Those observations gradually became the foundation of her own small brand, built not around advertising promises, but around accumulated experience. Every finished handle carried a simple burned mark identifying its Kentucky origin because Emily believed the story behind the material deserved to remain connected to the finished product. Visitors who toured the workshop often expected to see expensive machinery creating exceptional results. What they discovered instead was that the greatest advantage came from years of patient selection rather than sophisticated equipment. Machines shaped the wood, but judgment determined which piece deserved to become which tool. Orders continued increasing through word of mouth, woodworking publications, and trade shows where experienced craftsmen immediately recognized the unusual grain continuity visible in the finished handles. Revenue climbed steadily as specialty retailers, restoration suppliers, and independent toolmakers sought products they could not easily obtain elsewhere. What had once been considered an inconvenient pile of discarded timber had quietly evolved into the foundation of a respected business whose annual sales approached $300,000, not because Emily had discovered hidden treasure, but because she had spent more than a decade learning to recognize value long before the market remembered how to see it for itself. Years later, visitors driving through Jackson County often slowed when they reached the Carter farm, expecting to find the enormous piles of crooked hickory that local stories had described for so many years. Instead, they found something far quieter and far more meaningful. The rows of discarded logs had gradually become carefully managed. Inventory, the old equipment shed had become a respected workshop, and the lessons once shared between a grandfather, a father, and a daughter had become part of every handle leaving the property. Emily Carter never claimed that she had predicted the future. Whenever customers asked how she had known those forgotten logs would someday become valuable, she always gave the same simple answer. She had never tried to predict the market. She had only tried to understand the tree. That distinction explained everything. Let me tell you why her story continued spreading long after the business itself became successful. Woodworking schools invited her to speak about grain orientation instead of marketing. Forestry organizations asked her to discuss sustainable use of hardwood resources rather than business strategy. Young craftsmen visited her workshop expecting to learn advanced machining techniques, only to discover that Emily spent far more time teaching observation than production. She encouraged them to walk through the forest before entering a workshop, to study how trees responded to wind, gravity, moisture, and changing sunlight, and to remember that every piece of wood carried a history that deserved to be understood before it was cut. Many left realizing that craftsmanship began long before the first tool touched the material. The brand continued growing steadily because its reputation rested on consistency rather than rapid expansion. Professional users recommended the handles to coworkers. Restoration specialists trusted them for vintage American tools. Farmers passed them from one generation to the next along with the stories explaining where they had come from. Annual revenue remained impressive, yet Emily rarely spoke about sales figures because she believed they measured only the result, never the reason. The true achievement had happened years earlier, when she chose patience instead of convenience, while everyone else chose convenience instead of patience. Looking across her property one quiet autumn evening, she noticed young hickory trees beginning to grow along the edge of the woods where older timber had once stood. Their trunks were still thin, their branches still searching for light, and many already leaned gently around larger trees as they reached upward. Someone focused only on straight lumber might have seen imperfections beginning to form. Emily saw future strength taking shape one growing season at a time. Her grandfather had once told her that a forest was always teaching those willing to slow down long enough to listen. After everything that had happened, she finally understood exactly what he meant. The greatest opportunities are not always hidden beneath the ground waiting to be discovered. Sometimes they are lying in plain sight, dismissed by almost everyone because they do not match familiar expectations. Value does not appear the moment people recognize it. More often, value has been there from the very beginning, waiting patiently for someone with enough knowledge, enough discipline, and enough faith to see purpose where others see only waste.